The Story of Civilization, Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 3, continued, Cassette 7, Side 2. The Reformation, though he presumably favored it, ruined his market in Basel. No more religious pictures were asked of him. Payments on the paintings for the council hall were suspended. Rich men, frightened by the Peasants' War, retreated into privacy and parsimony, and thought the time unpropitious for portraits. Here the arts are freezing, wrote Erasmus from Basel in 1526. He gave Holbein letters of introduction to friends in Antwerp and London, and Holbein, leaving his family at home, sought fortune in the north. He visited Quentin Massais, and doubtless they exchanged notes about Erasmus. From Antwerp he crossed to England. Erasmus's letter assured him a cordial welcome from Thomas More, who gave him a place in his Chelsea home, and there he painted in 1526 the portrait of More that is now in the Frick Gallery in New York. To the hindsight of the historian, the tense and half-somber eyes foreshadow the devotion and tenacity of the martyr. To the insight of an artist, the wonder will be in the fur and folds of the sleeve. In 1527, Holbein painted Thomas More and his family, the oldest known group picture in Transalpine secular art. Late in 1528, Holbein, having made some pounds and shillings, returned to Basel, gave Erasmus a copy of More and his family, and rejoined his wife. Now he painted one of his greatest, most honest pictures, showing his own family with a realism unsparing to himself. Each of the three faces is sad, the girl resigned, almost hopeless, the boy gazing up plaintively at his mother, she looking upon them with grief and affection profoundly mirrored in her eyes, the grief of a wife who has lost the love of her husband, the affection of a mother whose children are her only tie to life. 3 years after painting this masterly self-indictment, Holbein left his family again. During the stay in Basel, he painted another portrait of Froben, and made 6 more of Erasmus, not as searchingly profound as those of 1523 to 1524. The town council renewed his commission to fresco its chambers, but, yielding to the triumphant iconoclasts, it condemned all religious pictures, and ruled that God has cursed all those who make them. Commissions fell, and in 1532 Holbein returned to England. There he painted portraits so plentifully that most of the figures dominating the English scene in those turbulent years are still alive by the magic of Holbein's hand. In the Queen's Library at Windsor are 87 sketches in charcoal or chalk, some for cartoons, most of them for portraits. Apparently the artist required only 1 or 2 sittings from his subjects, and then painted their likeness from such sketches. The Hanseatic merchants in London solicited his art, but did not inspire his best. For the Guildhall of the Hanse he painted 2 murals, preserved only in copies or drawings. One represented the triumph of poverty, the other the triumph of riches. Both are marvels of individualized character, living movement, and coherent design, and illustrate the motto of the Guild. Gold is the father of joy and the son of care. He who lacks it is sad, he who has it is uneasy. Thomas Cromwell, who was to exemplify this adage, submitted his hard face and soft frame to Holbein's brush in 1534. Through him the artist found access to the highest figures at the court. He painted the French ambassadors, and one of them, Charles de Solier, he portrayed with especial success, revealing the man beneath the vestments and insignia of office. 4 others, Sir Henry Guilford, controller of the royal household, Sir Nicholas Carew, royal equerry to the king, Robert Chessman, royal falconer to the king, and Dr. John Chambers, physician to the king, suggest the thick skins that alone could safely live near the parboiled king. Holbein became one of them about 1537 as official court painter. He received a workshop of his own in Whitehall Palace, dwelt in comfort, had mistresses and bastards like anybody else, and dressed in color and silk. He was called upon to decorate rooms, design ceremonial garments, book-bindings, weapons, tableware, seals, royal buttons and buckles, and the gems that Henry presented to his wives. In 1538 the king sent him to Brussels to paint Princess Christine of Denmark. She proved quite charming, and Henry would gladly have had her, but she took Duke Francis of Lorraine instead. Perhaps she preferred to hang in a gallery rather than die on the block. Holbein took the opportunity to visit Basel briefly. He arranged an annuity of 40 guilders, or about $1,000, for his wife, and hurried back to London. Soon thereafter came the commission to paint Anne of Cleves. Holbein almost foreshadowed the result in the sad eyes of the portrait now in the Louvre. For the king himself he painted several large pictures, nearly all lost. One survives in the Barber Surgeons' Hall in London, Henry VIII granting a charter of incorporation to the Barber Surgeons' Company. Henry dominates the scene in his robes of state. The artist made appealing portraits of Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, and the fifth wife, Catherine Howard. When Henry himself sat or stood for Holbein, the painter rose to the challenge and produced portraits surpassed in his own work only by the Louvre and Basel pictures of Erasmus. The portrait of 1536 shows the monarch teutonically pompous and stout. Henry liked it despite himself and commissioned Holbein to paint the royal family as a fresco in Whitehall Palace. This mural was destroyed by fire in 1698, but a copy made in 1667 for Charles II reveals a masterly design. At the upper left, Henry VII, pious and modest. Lower, his son, brandishing the symbols of power and spreading his legs like a colossus. At the right, his mother and his third wife. And in the center, a marble monument retailing in Latin the virtues of the kings. The figure of Henry VIII was elaborated with such realism that a legend arose about persons entering the room and mistaking the portrait for the living king. In 1540, Holbein painted a still more imposing Henry VIII in wedding dress. Finally, in 1542, he displayed Henry in the deterioration of mind and body. Nemesis here worked leisurely, lengthening the revenge of the gods from clean or sudden death to prolonged and ignominious decay. Two lovely pictures redeem the royal gallery, one of Prince Edward at the age of 2, all innocence, the other of Edward, aged 6, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This second portrait is a delight to behold. We may judge the art of Holbein when we see him, within a year or two, portray unflinchingly the obese pride of the father, and then catch with such mysterious skill the guileless kindliness of the son. At 45 in 1542, the artist pictured himself again, and with the same objectivity with which he had depicted the king. A suspicious, pugnacious fellow with carelessly kept graying hair and beard. And once more in 1543 in a roundel showing him in a gentler mood. In that year, plague came to London and chose him as one of its victims. Technically, he was one of the supreme painters. He saw meticulously, and so portrayed, every line, color, or attitude, every incidence or variation of light that could reveal significance was caught and pinned down upon the paper, linen, wood, or wall. What accuracy in line, what depth and smoothness and warmth in color, what skill in ordering details into a unified composition. But in many of the portraits, where the object was not the subject but the fee, we missed the sympathy that could see and feel with a man's secret soul. We find it in the Louvre and Basel Erasmus, and in the picture of his family. We miss, except in the Meyer Madonna, the idealism that ennobled the realism in the Van Eyck's Adoration of the Lamb. His indifference to religion kept him short of the grandeur of Grunewald, and marked him off from Dürer, who always had one foot in the Middle Ages. Holbein was neither Renaissance like Titian, nor Reformation like Cranach. He was German, Dutch, Flemish, English, matter-of-fact and practical sense. Perhaps its success prevented the effective entry of Italian pictorial principles and finesse into England. After him, Puritanism triumphed over the Elizabethan passion, and English painting languished till Hogarth came. At the same time, the glory departed from German painting. A flood of barbarism would have to pass over Central Europe before the sense of beauty would find voice there again. 7. Art in Spain and Portugal, 1515 to 1555. Despite El Greco and Velázquez, Cervantes and Calderón, Spain never had a Renaissance in the rich Italian sense. Her far-won wealth gave new ornaments to her Christian culture, it offered productive rewards to native genius in literature and art, but it did not flow into any exciting recapture, as in Italy and France, of that pagan civilization which had adorned the Mediterranean world before and after Christ, and which had begotten Seneca, Lucan, Martial, Quintilian, Trajan, and Hadrian on the soil of Spain itself. The remembrance of that classic era had been deeply overladen by the long struggle of Spanish Christianity with the Moors. All the glorious memories were of that protracted victory, and the faith that had won it became inseparable from the proud remembrance. While everywhere else in Europe the state was humiliating the church, in Spain the ecclesiastical organization grew stronger with the generations. It challenged and ignored the papacy, even when Spaniards ruled the Vatican. It survived the pious absolutism of Ferdinand and Charles V and Philip II, and then dominated every aspect of Spanish life. The church in Spain was almost the sole patron of the arts. Therefore it called the tune, named the themes, and made art, like philosophy, the handmaiden of theology. The Spanish Inquisition appointed inspectors to outlaw nudity, immodesty, paganism, or heresy in art, to specify the manner of treating sacred subjects in sculpture and painting, and to direct Spanish art toward the transmission and confirmation of the faith. And yet Italian influence was pouring into Spain. The rise of Spaniards to the papacy, the conquest of Naples and Milan by Spanish kings, the campaigns of Spanish armies and the missions of Spanish statesmen and churchmen in Italy, the busy trade between Spanish and Italian ports, the visits of Spanish artists like Forment and the Berruguetes to Italy, of Italian artists like Torrigiano and Leone Leoni to Spain. All these factors affected Spanish art in methods, ornament, and style, hardly in spirit or theme, more in painting than in sculpture, and in architecture least. The cathedrals dominated the landscape and the towns as the faith dominated life. Traveling in Spain is a pilgrimage from one to another of these mighty fanes. Their awesome immensity, their wealth of interior ornament, the dim-lit silence of their naves, the devoted stonework of their cloisters, accentuate the simplicity and poverty of the picturesque tiled dwellings that huddle below, looking up to them as the promise of a better world. The Gothic style still ruled in the giant cathedrals that rose above Salamanca in 1513 and Segovia in 1522. But at Granada, Diego de Siloé, architect son of a Gothic sculptor, designed the interior of the cathedral with classic columns and capitals, and crowned the Gothic plan with a classic dome in 1525. The style of the Italian Renaissance completely dislodged Gothic in the palace of Charles V at Granada. Charles had reproved the Bishop of Cordova for spoiling the great mosque by building within its 850 pillars a Christian church, but he sinned almost as grievously when he tore down some halls and courts of the Alhambra to make room for a structure whose stern mass and dull symmetry might have passed without offense amid kindred buildings in Rome, but proved strikingly out of harmony with the frail elegance and gay diversity of the Moorish citadel. Something of the Moor's flair for architectural decoration appeared in the Plateresque style that marked chiefly the civil architecture of this reign. It took its name from its resemblance to the complex and delicate ornament lavished by the silversmith, platero, or goldsmith upon plate and other objects of their art. It topped and flanked portals and windows with winding arabesques of stone. It grooved or spiraled or flowered columns with Moorish fantasy. It pierced grilles and balustrades with marble foliage and embroidery. This Plateresco marked the Obispo Chapel at Madrid, the Church of Santo Tomas at Avila, the choir of the cathedral at Cordova, and it disported itself without restraint in the Ayuntamiento, or Town Hall of Seville, from 1526 on. Portugal adopted the style on a portal suffused with ornament and columns carved with decoration in the magnificent monastery of Santa Maria at Belém, in 1517 and onward. Charles V took the style to the lowlands in Germany, where it flourished its signature on the town halls of Antwerp and Leyden, and the castle of Heidelberg. Philip II found Plateresque too florid for his taste, and under his frowns it died an early death. Spanish sculpture yielded more readily than architecture to the swelling Italian tide. Pietro Torrigiano, after breaking Michelangelo's nose in Florence and bearding Henry VIII in London, settled in Seville in 1521, and modeled in terracotta an ungainly St. Jerome, which Goya mistakenly judged to be the supreme work of modern sculpture. Feeling poorly paid for a statue of the Virgin, Torrigiano smashed it to bits, was arrested by the Inquisition, and died in its jails. Damian Forment, returning to Aragon from Italy, carried the spirit of the Renaissance on his chisel and in his boasts. He called himself the rival of Phidias and Praxiteles, and was accepted at his own estimate. The ecclesiastical authorities allowed him to carve likenesses of himself and his wife on the base of the reredos that he made for the Abbey of Monte Aragon. For the church of Nuestra Senora del Pilar at Saragossa, he cut in alabaster a spacious retable in bas-relief, combining Gothic with Renaissance elements, painting with sculpture, color with form. To another retable in the Cathedral of Huesca, Forment devoted the last 13 years of his life, from 1520 to 1533. As Pedro Berruguete had dominated Spanish painting in the half-century before Charles V, so his son became the leading Spanish sculptor of this age. Alonso learned the art of color from his father, then went to Italy and worked with Raphael in painting, with Bramante and Michelangelo in statuary. When he came back to Spain in 1520, he brought with him Michelangelo's penchant for figures caught in tense emotion or violent attitudes. Charles appointed him court sculptor and painter. At Valladolid he worked for 6 years carving in wood an altar screen, 42 by 30 feet, for the church of San Benito el Real. Only fragments remain, chiefly a San Sebastian, vividly colored, with blood pouring from the wounds. In 1535 he joined with his chief rival, Felipe de Borgoña, to carve choir stalls in the Toledo Cathedral. Here, too, the Michelangelesque manner swayed his hand and presaged Baroque in Spain. When he neared 80, he was commissioned to erect in the Hospital of St. John at Toledo a monument to its founder, Cardinal Juan de Tavera. He took his son Alonso as helper, created one of the chefs-d'oeuvre of Spanish sculpture, and died in the attempt in his 75th year in 1561. Spanish painting, still in tutelage to Italy and Flanders, produced no outstanding master under Charles V. The emperor favored foreign painters, imported Antonis More to make portraits of Spanish notables, and for himself declared that he would allow none but the great Titian to paint him. The only Spanish painter of this age whose fame crossed the Pyrenees was Luis de Morales. The first 50 years of his life were spent in the poverty and obscurity of Badajoz, painting for churches and chapels in the province of Estremadura. He was 54 when Philip II bade him come and paint in the Escorial in 1564. He presented himself in magnificent array, which the king thought unbecoming in an artist, but Philip softened when he learned that Louis had spent his life savings to attire himself fitly for an audience with his majesty. Morales's Christ carrying the cross did not strike the royal fancy, and he returned to Badajoz and penury. Several of his pictures can be seen at the Hispanic Society in New York, all of them beautiful, but the best example of his work is a Virgin and Child in the Prado, a bit too redolent of Raphael. Philip, passing through Badajoz in 1581, allotted the artist a tardy pension, which enabled him, now disabled by palsy and failing eyes, to eat regularly during the 5 years left to him of life. The artisans of Spain were often artists in all but name. Spanish lace and leather continued supreme in Europe. The woodworkers, too, were unsurpassed. Théophile Gautier thought that Gothic art had never come closer to perfection than in the choir stalls of Toledo Cathedral. Metalworkers made works of art out of sanctuary screens, window grills, balcony railings, door hinges, even nails. Goldsmiths and silversmiths transformed some of the precious metals flowing in from America into ornaments for princes and vessels for the church. Famous were the custodias they made in filigree silver or gold to hold the consecrated host. Gil Vicente, not satisfied to be the leading dramatist of Portugal and Spain in this period, executed a monstrance for displaying the host to the congregation, which has been rated the masterpiece of the goldsmith's work in Portugal. And Francisco de Holanda, Portuguese despite his name, carried on with distinction the dying art of illumination. All in all, this less than half a century came off with credit in the field of art, despite the absorption and disruption of energies in the religious revolution. The masters in architecture, sculpture, and painting were hardly comparable to the giants who shook all Europe with theology. Religion was the tune of the time, and art could only provide an accompaniment. But Il Rosso, Primaticcio, Lescaut, Delorme, Goujon, and the Clouets in France, the Berruguetes in Spain, Bruegel in Flanders, Cranach in Germany, Holbein everywhere, made an honorable roster of artists for an age so agitated and so brief. Art is order, yet everything was in chaos, not religion only, but morals, social order, art itself. Gothic was fighting its losing battle with classic forms, and the artist, uprooted from his own past, had to experiment with tentatives that could not give him the grandeur of a stability mortised in confident time. In the universal turbulence, faith too was hesitant and ceased to give clear imperatives to art. Religious images were attacked and shattered. Sacred themes that had inspired the creator and the beholder of beauty were losing their power to stir either genius or admiration or piety. And in science, the greatest revolution of all was deposing the earth from its theological throne, and losing in the endless void the little globe, whose divine visitation had formed the medieval mind and generated medieval art. When would stability come again? Chapter 37. Science in the Age of Copernicus, 1517 to 1565. 1. The Cult of the Occult. It is remarkable that this age, so absorbed in theology and scholarship, should have produced two men of the highest standing in the history of science, Copernicus and Berzelius, and curious that the books that contained their lifeblood should have appeared in one Annus Mirabilis, 1543. Some conditions favored science: the discovery of America and the exploration of Asia, the demands of industry and the extension of commerce, turned up knowledge that often contradicted traditional beliefs and encouraged fresh thought. Translations from Greek and Arabic, the printing of Apollonius's Conics in 1537 and the Greek text of Archimedes in 1544 stimulated mathematics and physics. But many travelers were liars or careless. Printing spread nonsense more widely than knowledge, and scientific instruments, though numerous, were almost primitive. The microscope, the telescope, the thermometer, the barometer, the micrometer, the microchronometer were still in the future. The Renaissance was enamored of literature and style, politely interested in philosophy, almost indifferent to science. The Renaissance popes were not hostile to science. Leo X and Clement VII listened with open minds to Copernican ideas, and Paul III received without trembling the dedication of Copernicus's world-shaking Book of Revolutions. But the reaction under Paul IV, the development of the Inquisition in Italy, and the dogmatic decrees of the Council of Trent made scientific studies increasingly difficult and dangerous after 1555. Protestantism could not favor science, for it based itself on an infallible Bible. Luther rejected the Copernican astronomy because the Bible told of Joshua commanding the sun, not the earth, to stand still. Melanchthon was inclined to science. He studied mathematics, physics, astronomy, and medicine, and lectured on the history of mathematics in antiquity. But his broad spirit was overwhelmed by the forceful nature of his master, and by the predominance of a narrowed Lutheranism after Luther's death. Calvin had little use for science, Knox none. A discouraging milieu of occultism continued to surround, confuse, and sometimes, as in Cardan and Paracelsus, threaten the sanity of the would-be scientist. Hermetic lore from Egypt, mystical Pythagoreanism and Neoplatonism from Greece, the Kabbalah from Judaism, bemused 1,000 groping minds. Legends and miracles infested historiography, and travelers told of fire-breathing dragons and rope-climbing fakirs. Almost any unusual event in public or private life was interpreted as contrived by God or Satan for the warning or edification, the temptation or ruination of man. Many believed that comets and meteors were fireballs hurled by an angry deity. Cheap literature entered every literate home, with assurances that baser metals could be turned into gold. And, says a contemporary report, all the tailors, shoemakers, servants, and maids who hear and read about these things give all the coins they can spare to perambulating and fraudulent practitioners of such arts. At a trial in England in 1549, William Wycherley, a conjurer, said there were 500 like him in the island. Itinerant students in Germany sold magical protections against witches and devils. Charms and talismans guaranteed to divert musket balls were popular with soldiers. The Mass itself was often used as a charm to bring rain or sunshine, or victory in war. Prayers for rain were common and sometimes seemed too successful, in which cases the church bells were rung to warn the heavens to stop. In 1526 to 1531, the monks of Troyes formally excommunicated the caterpillars that were plaguing the crops, but added that the interdict would be effective only for lands whose peasants had paid their church tithes. Perhaps more events were ascribed to Satan than to God. Scarcely a year goes by, lamented a Protestant writer in 1563, without the most appalling news from numbers of principalities, towns, and villages of the shameless and horrible ways in which the prince of hell, by bodily apparition and in all sorts of forms, is trying to extinguish the new and shining light of Holy Evangel. Luther joined the commonalty in attributing most diseases to demons entering the body, which, after all, is not altogether unlike our current theory. Many believed that diseases were caused by the evil eye or other magical means, and that they could be cured by magic potions, which again is not too far removed from our present practice. Most remedies were administered according to the position of the planets, hence medical students studied astrology. Astrology verged on science by assuming a rule of law in the universe and operating largely through experiment. The belief that the movements and positions of the stars determined human events was not quite as general as before, yet there were 30,000 astrologers in Paris in the 16th century, all ready to cast a horoscope for a coin. Almanacs of astrological predictions were bestsellers. Rabelais parodied them in the Pantagruelian prognostications of Master Alcofribas. Luther and the Sorbonne here agreed with him, and condemned astrology in all its forms. The Church officially frowned upon astrological predictions, as implying determinism and the subjection of the Church to the stars. Yet Paul III, one of the greatest minds of the age, would call no important meeting of the consistory, said an ambassador to the papal court, and would take no trip without choosing his days and observing the constellations. Francis I, Catherine de Medicis, Charles IX, Julius II, Leo X, and Adrian VI consulted astrologers. Melanchthon changed the date of Luther's birth to give him a more propitious horoscope, and begged him not to travel under a new moon. One astrologer of this period is still popular. Nostradamus was, in French, Michel de Notre Dame. He professed to be a physician and an astronomer, and was accepted as semi-official astrologer by Catherine de Medicis. She built an observatory for him in Les Halles. In 1564 he predicted a life of 90 years for Charles IX, who died 10 years later at the age of 24. At his own death in 1566 he left a book of prophecies so wisely ambiguous that some line or another could be applied to almost any event in later history. Because Christians of the 16th century believed in the possibility of obtaining supernatural powers from demons, and because the fear of demons was ingrained in their rearing, they felt an obligation to burn witches. Luther and Calvin seconded Pope Innocent VIII in urging the prosecution of witches. "I would have no compassion on these witches," said Luther. "I would burn them all." 4 were burned at Wittenberg on June 29, 1540, 34 at Geneva in 1545. The Reformers, of course, had biblical warrant for these bonfires, and Protestant dependence upon the Scriptures gave new urgency to Exodus chapter 22, verse 18. The Catholic practice of exorcism encouraged the belief in witchcraft by assuming the power of devils lodged in human beings. Luther claimed that his Leipzig opponent, Johannes Eck, had signed a pact with Satan, and Johannes Cochleus retorted that Luther was a byproduct of Satan's dalliance with Margaret Luther. Accusations of witchcraft were sometimes used to get rid of personal enemies. The accused had a choice of prolonged torture to elicit a confession or death as the result of a confession, and in 16th century Europe the administration of torture was systematized with a cold-blooded ferocity unknown to the heathen nations. Many victims seemed to have believed in their own guilt, that they had had transactions, sometimes sexual, with devils. Some of the accused committed suicide. A French judge noted 15 such cases within a year. Secular magistrates often exceeded ecclesiastics in the enthusiasm of this persecution. The laws of Henry VIII in 1541 punished with death any of several practices ascribed to witches, but the Spanish Inquisition branded stories and confessions of witchcraft as the delusions of weak minds, and cautioned its agents in 1538 to ignore the popular demand for the burning of witches. Fewer voices were raised to protect witches than in defense of heretics, and the heretics themselves believed in witches. But in 1563, Johannes Vir, a physician of Cleves, issued a treatise De Praestigiis Daemonum, on demonic deceptions, which timidly dared to mitigate the mania. He did not question the existence of demons, but suggested that witches were the innocent victims of demonic possession, and were deluded by the devil into believing the absurdities that they confessed. Women and persons suffering from illness of body or mind were, he thought, especially subject to possession by demons. He concluded that witchcraft was not a crime but a disease, and he appealed to the princes of Europe to stop the execution of these helpless women. A few years later, Vere replaced himself in his time by writing a detailed description of hell, its leaders, its organization, and its operation. The spirit of the age spoke in the story of Faust. We first hear of Georg Faust in 1507, in a letter of Johannes Trithemius, who calls him a mountebank, and then in 1513 when Mucianus Rufus accords him no gentler term. Philip Begardi, of Worms' physician, wrote in 1539, "Of late years a remarkable man has been travelling through nearly every province, principality, and kingdom, and has boasted highly of his great skill not only in medicine, but in chiromancy, physiognomy, crystal gazing, and other kindred arts, and has not denied that he is called Faustus, that is, favored or fortunate. The historic Faust seems to have died in 1539, by the devil wringing his neck," said Melanchthon. 4 years later, the legend of Faust as in league with the devil made its appearance in the Sermones Conviviales of Johannes Gast, a Protestant pastor at Basel. Two old notions combined to transform the historical charlatan into a figure of legend, drama, and art: that man might obtain magic powers by compacts with Satan, and that secular learning is an insolent conceit likely to lead a man to hell. In one phase, the legend was supposed to be a Catholic caricature of Luther. In a deeper view, it expressed the religious repudiation of profane knowledge, as opposed to a humble acceptance of the Bible as in itself sufficient erudition and truth. Goethe repudiated the repudiation and allowed the hunger for knowledge to purify itself by its application to the common good. The legend of Faust came to bitter life in Henry Cornelius Agrippa. Born of good family at Cologne in 1487, he found his way to Paris and fell in there with some mystics or quacks who claimed esoteric wisdom. Hungry for knowledge and fame, he took up alchemy, studied the Kabbalah, and became convinced that there was a world of enlightenment unattainable by ordinary perception or reasoning. He sent to Trithemius a manuscript, De Occulta Philosophia, with a personal letter. "I wondered much, and indeed felt indignant, that up to this time no one had arisen to vindicate so sublime and sacred a study from the accusation of impiety. Thus my spirit was aroused, and I too conceived the desire to philosophize, thinking that I should produce a work not unworthy of praise, if I could vindicate that ancient magic, studied by all the wise, purged and freed from the errors of impiety, and endowed with its own reasonable system." Trithemius replied with good counsel, "Speak of things public to the public, but of things lofty and secret only to the loftiest and most private of your friends. Hay to an ox and sugar to a parrot. Rightly interpret this, lest you, as some others have been, be trampled down by oxen." Whether through caution or lack of a publisher, Agrippa refrained for 20 years from sending his book through the press. The Emperor Maximilian summoned him to war in Italy. He gave a good account of himself on the battlefield, but took occasion to lecture on Plato at the University of Pisa and to receive degrees in law and medicine at Pavia. He was appointed town advocate at Metz in 1518, and soon lost that position by interfering with the prosecution of a young woman accused of witchcraft. He procured her release from the Inquisition, but he thought it wise then to change his habitat, this in 1519. For 2 years he served Louise of Savoy as physician. However, he entered into so many disputes that she stopped his salary. He moved to Antwerp with his second wife and his children, was made historiographer and court librarian to the Regent Margaret of Austria, and managed to eat regularly. Now he composed his most important work, De Incertitudine et Vanitate Scientiarum. He published it in 1530, and then, strangely enough, issued his youthful De Occulta Philosophia, with a preface disclaiming continued belief in the mystic abracadabra there detailed. The two books together offended all the cognizant world. The occult philosophy urged that as the human soul pervades and governs the body, so the spiritus mundi pervades and governs the universe. That this great reservoir of soul force can be tapped by a mind morally purified and patiently instructed in Magian ways. So reinforced, the mind can discover the hidden qualities of objects, numbers, letters, words, can penetrate the secrets of the stars, and can gain mastery over the forces of the earth and the demons of the air. The book circulated widely, and its many posthumous editions led to legends about Agrippa's compact with a devil, who accompanied him in the guise of his dog, and enabled him to fly over the globe and sleep in the moon. The vicissitudes of life abated Agrippa's claims on supersensual experience. He learned that no magic or alchemy could feed his family or keep him out of jail for debt. He turned in angry disillusionment upon the pursuit of knowledge, and wrote at the age of 39 on the uncertainty and vanity of the sciences, the most skeptical book of the 16th century before Montaigne. "I well perceive," ran his exordium, "what a bloody battle I have to fight. First of all, the lousy grammarians will make a stir, and peevish poets, trifle-selling historians, blustering orators, obstinate logicians, fatal astrologers, monstrous magicians, contentious philosophers. All knowledge is uncertain, all science is vain, and to know nothing is the happiest life." It was knowledge that destroyed the happiness of Adam and Eve. It was Socrates' confession of ignorance that brought him content and fame. All sciences are only the ordinances and opinions of men, as injurious as profitable, as pestilent as wholesome, as ill as good, in no part perfect, but doubtful and full of error and contention. Agrippa begins his devastation with the alphabet, and upbraids it for its bewildering inconsistencies of pronunciation. He laughs at the grammarians, whose exceptions are more numerous than their rules, and who are repeatedly outvoted by the people. Poets are madmen. No one well in his wits can write poetry. Most history is a fable, not une fable convenue, as Voltaire would mistakenly call it, but an ever-changing fable which each historian and generation transforms anew. Oratory is the seduction of the mind by eloquence into error. Occultism is a sham. His own book about it, Agrippa now warns, was false, or if you will, lying. If formerly he practiced astrology, magic, divination, alchemy, and other such nesciences, it was mostly through the importunate solicitation of patrons demanding esoteric knowledge and able to pay. The Kabbalah is nothing else but a pestilent superstition. As for the philosophers, the self-cancelling diversity of their opinions puts them out of court. We may leave them to refute one another. So far as philosophy seeks to deduce morality from reason, it is stultified by the irrational contrariety of morals in place and time. Whereof it cometh to pass that which at one time was vice, another time is accounted virtue, and that which in one place is virtue, in another is vice. The arts and occupations are as vitiated as the sciences, with falsehood and vanity. Every court is a school of corrupt customs, and a refuge of detestable wickedness. Trade is treachery. Treasurers are thieves. Their hands are sticky with bird-lime, their fingers end in hooks. War is the slaughter of many and the sport of the few. Medicine is a certain art of manslaughter, and often there is more danger in the physician and the medicine than in the sickness itself. What is the upshot of all this? If science is transient opinion, and philosophy is the vain speculation of mental maggots on the nature of the infinite, what shall a man live by? Only by the word of God as revealed in the Bible. This has an evangelical ring, and indeed, scattered among Agrippa's doubts are sundry affirmations of reform. He rejects the temporal power of the popes, and even their spiritual authority when this contravenes Scripture. He denounces the Inquisition as persuading men not with reason and Scripture, but with fire and faggots. He wishes the Church would spend less on cathedrals and more on charity. But he goes beyond the Reformers when he admits that the authors of the Old and the New Testament were liable to error. Christ alone is always right and true. Him only should we trust. In him is the last refuge of the mind and the soul. Agrippa enjoyed the furor caused by this rampage, but he paid for the pleasure through his remaining years. Charles V demanded that he recant his criticism of the Church. When he refused, his salary was cut short. Imprisoned for debt, he laid responsibility on the emperor, who was behind in payments to his court historiographer. Cardinal Campeggio and the Bishop of Liège secured his release, but Charles banished him from imperial territory in 1531. Agrippa moved to Lyon, where, says an uncertain tradition, he was again imprisoned for debt. Set free, he passed on to Grenoble, and there, aged 48, he died. Probably he had a share in forming the skepticism of Montaigne, but his only popular book was on the occultism that he had renounced. Occult thought and practices flourished to the end of the century. 2. The Copernican Revolution. Mathematical advances that now seem trivial sharpened the tools of calculation in this age. Michael Stiefel's Arithmetica Integra of 1544 introduced our plus and minus signs, and Robert Record's Whetstone of Wit in 1557 first used our equals sign in print. The once famous arithmetics of Adam Riese persuaded Germany to pass from reckoning with counters to written computation. Johannes Werner published in 1522 the first modern treatise on conic sections, and Georg Rheticus, besides serving as midwife to Copernicus, carried on the work of Regiomontanus in trigonometry. Astronomy had at its disposal better calculations than instruments. On the basis of these calculations, some astrologers predicted a second deluge for February 11, 1524, when Jupiter and Saturn would join in Pisces. Thereupon, Toulouse built an ark of refuge, and cautious families stored food on mountain tops. Most of the astronomical instruments were of medieval origin: celestial and terrestrial spheres, Jacob's staff, an astrolabe, an armillary sphere, quadrants, cylinders, clocks, compasses, and several other devices, but no telescope and no photography. With this equipment, Copernicus moved the earth. Nikolai Kopernik, as Poland calls him, Niklas Kopernik, as Germany calls him, Nicolaus Copernicus, as scholars call him, was born in 1473 at Thorn, or Toren, on the Vistula in West Prussia, which 7 years before had been ceded to Poland by the Teutonic Knights. He was a Prussian in space, a Pole in time. His mother came of a prosperous Prussian family. His father hailed from Krakow, settled in Thorn, and dealt in copper. When the father died in 1483, the mother's brother, Lucas Vatselrode, Prince Bishop of Ermland, took charge of the children. Nicolaus was sent at 18 to the University of Krakow to prepare for the priesthood. Not liking the scholasticism that had there suppressed humanism, he persuaded his uncle to let him study in Italy. The uncle had him appointed a canon of the cathedral at Frauenburg in Polish East Prussia, and gave him leave of absence for 3 years. At the University of Bologna, between 1497 and 1500, Copernicus studied mathematics, physics, and astronomy. One of his teachers, Domenico de Novara, once a pupil of Regiomontanus, criticized the Ptolemaic system as absurdly complex, and introduced his students to ancient Greek astronomers who had questioned the immobility and central position of the earth. Philolaus, the Pythagorean, in the 5th century before Christ, had held that the earth and the other planets moved around Hestia, a central fire invisible to us because all known parts of the earth are turned away from it. Cicero quoted Hicetus of Syracuse, also of the 5th century before Christ, as believing that the sun, the moon, and the stars stood still, and that their apparent motion was due to the axial rotation of the earth. Archimedes and Plutarch reported that Aristarchus of Samos, 310 to 230 B.C., had suggested the revolution of the earth around the sun, had been accused of impiety, and had withdrawn the suggestion. According to Plutarch, Seleucus of Babylonia had revived the idea in the 2nd century before Christ. This heliocentric view might have triumphed in antiquity had not Claudius Ptolemy of Alexandria, in the 2nd century of our era, restated the geocentric theory with such force and learning that hardly anyone thereafter dared to challenge it. Ptolemy himself had ruled that in seeking to explain phenomena, science should adopt the simplest possible hypothesis consistent with accepted observations. Yet Ptolemy, like Hipparchus before him, to explain the apparent motion of the planets, had been compelled by the geocentric theory to assume a bewildering complexity of epicycles and eccentrics. Could any simpler hypothesis be found? Nicole Orem, 1330 to 1382, and